a little bit longer and obviously well thought out and balanced like Brian tends to be. He says, it's ironic that as the game makes a play of the unpredictability of Super League and anyone can beat anyone mantra, we then vote in a change to the salary cap that will widen the spending power between the rich clubs and the rest. Whilst I don't think clubs like Wakey should hold back the rest, I'm not sure that the changes to the salary cap will achieve much. We're told that only Wigan have a marquee player, so why do we need all clubs to be able to have two each? The changes won't do anything to bring in top talent from outside Super League, as the wage gap between Super League and the NRL is too big, and the gamble on a big money union player is too high. To be honest, I'm not sure that the changes will have any positive effect on the game unless we're somehow able to increase central distributions so that more clubs can spend the full cap.
There we go.
I read somewhere that 10 of the 12 Super League clubs are spending full cap this year.
Oh.
Or, as good as full cap. I'd be surprised if it was 10.
That's a high number.
But, you look at some of the players that Cass have brought in and the money they've had available to spend on players because of sales of people like Darryl Clark and the money that they'll eventually get for Dennis Solomona being around, what, 4
How much money will... I mean, they'll have that money in terms of being able to invest it in transfer fees, but selling...
But they've not had to pay transfer fees, have they?
No, exactly. What I'm saying is that selling Darryl Clark's wages at Castleford, whilst they will have been reasonable, will have been exponentially more when he got his big money move up to Warrington. So was he necessarily on a very, very high...
No, but they got a transfer fee, which meant that club could use that money to pay the wages of another player that they got for free, because they couldn't have afforded to without that money. Do you see what I mean?
I suppose so.
So they get 250k, right? And they sign 3... I'm not. They sign 4 players and give them like 75k each, whereas before they were only able to sign players for 40k. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. I'm with you. I'm back on board.
Anyway, so if 10 teams are spending to the cap currently, then that just indicates how much the cap needed to go up after it's been so stagnant. Forget about where we are on player drain or player retention or whatever from that point of view.
Yeah.
If people are being able to spend to the cap, and there's the 50% revenue clause in there still, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
Then the cap can go up, you would think. Whilst there hasn't been a clamouring for marquee players to this point, I still think that's the best adaptation we've had to the rule, because it doesn't widen the gap too much, because 1 or 2, or even if you extend it to 3 or 4 players, aren't going to make the massive difference compared to having a bigger overall spend that you're allowed to do. So I actually was always in support of increasing the marquee player, not just because it means Wigan can throw some money at George Williams, because don't forget, Warrington are going to throw a shit ton of cash at him to try and get him to go there as well, because they can afford to. Salford might do the same. Do you know what I mean? It's not a done deal that Wigan get to retain him just because we've got an extra marquee player now to throw the money at. But
I've got my own thoughts on George Williams specifically in terms of where he'll go, but yeah.
But anyway,
I don't think it matters how much money you've got for him particularly, but go on.
I think he'll earn more in this country than he'll get offered in the NRL, though. That's the thing.
I don't necessarily think it matters what you get. I think it's the experience of going there and playing.
Maybe.
I think that draw, and then make a success of yourself, and then the money is consequential rather than...
Well,
do you know what I mean? I don't want to bog down this into George Williams.
The top star players aren't going to come over from Australia, but it might mean you can spend a bit of money to get bigger names, or names that have gone back, or stop players going, I think, is the biggest aim of these increases. Stop players like Ben Curry and George Williams and like Callum Watkins or whoever, Zach Hardacre, actually going. And obviously the bringing players back thing, Eastman and Chris Ashton will be off cap if someone wants to sign them.
Mm-hmm. You spend a lot of money to get those two back, though. That's the thing. I just wonder if the economy now between what exists between rugby union and NRL and us is just to, like, let's call it the exchange rate that exists in terms of what we can afford to pay. The quality and talent that exists in those other two competitions is too big of a gap now in some respects, even with the changes that we're making. And it would take a sea change and a massive increase, because over 3 years, a £300,000 nominally a £300,000 a year increase, I don't think that's enormous. I don't think that's necessarily going to make a massive fluctuation in terms of what teams are doing, what they're planning to spend. I don't see it drawing in people. I don't see the exemptions necessarily being the pull, because I don't think that professional sportsmen are necessarily all motivated by show me the money.
So you think they might as well have not bothered?
No, I'm not saying they might as well not bothered, but I'm saying that we've got these lofty... I think what actually the salary cap increases do is almost reward the players at the rugby league player, and let's put some more money in the pockets of our lads and grow the sport that way, but don't focus outwards too much in terms of like, oh, we need to get these... There's not this raft of ex-league players dying to get back into rugby league.
Or there's not this raft of league players dying to get into rugby union either.
Exactly. So I like the fact that the money's going up because it pays the lads a bit more, and they're the ones that entertain us on the field, and it gives clubs scope to, if they implement it right, develop things like, you know, the younger players, and that's something I feel quite strong about, reserve grades and under 23s, and having that system be fostered and encouraged by these changes. That's something I'm pleased with. That's the big positive for me, because I think that's a trick that we've been missing recently. If you think in terms of developing certain players and the times and speeds at which different players develop when they're young, they're not getting necessarily that opportunity. I was reading something about Jamie Peacock and like from my club, Jamie Peacock, Stuart Fielding. They didn't smash their way in. They weren't John Bateman. They weren't first team players at 17. Peacock took until he was sort of 21, 22, and Fielding similarly to... Fielding was the opposite of that. Fielding wasn't. Yeah. It was, you know, Peacock wasn't a Fielding, and Peacock went on to have a stellar career. But maybe in the environment we live in, he might have been lost to the game. So I like the idea that this could be used to foster a more effective reserve grade or an effective reserve grade, and an effective way to keep younger players in the sport and not lose them out the bottom end. If you see what I mean, that's what I'm pleased with.
I think some of the changes give scope for that, especially at the bigger clubs that can afford it, and Wigan already take advantage of that sort of model of having a large base of younger players who are unproven, so you don't pay them loads, but can actually come in and do a job because they're learning in a professional environment every day.
Yeah, exactly.
But I'm a big fan of the marquee change because, like I said, I don't think it upsets competitive balance too much to add an extra one or two players, and most people aren't using it at the moment, but I think they would have done had the top level not increased. It would have been a way for better off clubs that can afford to meet the cap now to spend that extra money. I think there are players out there who would be getting the designation of marquee players if their club's overall spend took them over the cap.
Yeah.
But,
I think
so there's other players basically that are earning more than 175k right now, I would suggest.
Yes.
But the headline increase I'm not always a big fan of. I think it's okay because it's not too dramatic. So like you're saying, it's almost like, is it just going to give a pay rise to a few lower like players that are good? Say players that are 7 out of 10 on the star power scale will get pay rises out of this. Like, they probably haven't seen since they were 22, 23 and first became like regulars in the first team, got the first team contract. They probably haven't had a pay rise since then, unless they've gone to another club. But going to another club means you're not at Leeds or Wigan or St Helens anymore. You're not necessarily going to win trophies, potentially. That's all changing, hopefully. We're seeing wins spreading out, and we're seeing Salford and Hull and...
We look at the league table at the moment, don't you?
And Wakefield definitely aren't spending to the cap, and they're in 5th at the moment, and because injuries do happen at other clubs, you can take advantage of circumstances like that as a club like Wakefield in a good run and compete. I don't think the cap changes are going to prevent that from being the case, but just doing marquee would certainly, and the other exemptions certainly wouldn't have affected that happening. What needs to happen is the distribution of resources, of expertise, of best practice needs to be widened out, needs to be shared out. These clubs need to be more sharing with each other of their resources to the effect that it strengthens everyone, because these are interdependent organisations. The problem is promotion and relegation undermines that, because you don't want to give someone who could stay in the league instead of you any headway at all. So that we need to get around that problem whilst increasing the central funding to the weaker clubs. Otherwise, how do you make this? You're only as strong as your weakest teams, I would suggest. But if you can get 10 teams spending full cap, if you can get 15 teams, 16 teams spending full cap, imagine where we'd be at then. But I don't know how you do that without taking money off Wigan, Leeds, Warrington and Leigh, who've got the cash, and Salford, who've got the cash, although Leigh and Salford's cases, owners have got the cash, more so than the club can afford it.
Which is the other side of that
Yeah.
coin. If suddenly a rich owner pulls out of any of these, out of the majority, maybe with the exception of 2 or 3 clubs, if the backers pull out, these clubs are facing a very different financial future.
Yeah. Overall, though, I think it's positive. It's a positive story.
Yes.
It does give us the option of being able to retain some players if financial motivations are a big factor. It does give players more money and does bridge that gap between the academy team players and the under 22 and sort of the 22-year-old players who might still be able to stick around. Then more teams might run reserve grades, or at least you'll reg properly.
Yeah, I agree. Right, so let's look at some other news then. And St Helens have confirmed head coach Kieran Cunningham has parted company with the club. Saints' 14-all draw with Huddersfield on Friday was Cunningham's final game in charge. Club chairman Eamon McManus said Kieran has been with the club for 24 years as man, boy, player and coach. The commitment he has shown the club throughout in every capacity has been without equal. It is both upsetting and disappointing for us all that it has ended at this point in time. Kieran nevertheless understands the position and, as a mark of the man he is, wishes only well and good to the club, its players and everyone associated with it. His statue outside the ground is a deserved reflection of his immense contribution to the club. That is clear, obvious and permanent. We will now look to move the club forward and will immediately commence with the search for a new head coach. St Helens is a world-class club with a great squad of players and its only objective will be continuous success at the highest level. Assistant coaches Sean Long, Jamal Loalisi will be joined by under-19s coach Derek Trainer to form an interim coaching team until a new head coach is appointed and in place. It's been coming for a while.
It's not entirely surprising because of the way the team have played has been an issue, hasn't it? And obviously the draw against Huddersfield was a disappointing return to that. Whilst they had plenty, James Roby was out, but other than that, they had the first choice backline in situ.
Yeah.
From 1 to 7.
Well, they got off to a great start in that game.
Decent, they had the forward pack in. Everyone was playing basically with the James Roby.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head,
I can't think of anyone I missed when I was watching the tries back.
Yeah.
So.
Right, I've noted down some bits to sort of support it. Actually, why he's gone. So this year they're only scoring at less than 17 points a game. Which obviously we're only 8 weeks in and they're only conceding just under 17 points a game as well. But it's not exciting rugby to watch and the crowds are down. They're below 10,000 average this year, which isn't what you want to be seeing from a St Helens club. And last season's points per games total, so the amount of points they scored per game, 25.2, was the second lowest in Super League, in the history of Super League from the St Helens club.
Right.
So it was the second worst attacking year in the history of Super League. The worst was in 2013 under Nathan Brown. Before then they won the title in 2014. But yeah, and the 21.4 points per game they were conceding was their worst defensive performance. Don't you all? I thought this was interesting.
No, it is interesting.
It's the worst defensive performance since 2004. So that's a consistent amount of time since. And back then they were the entertainers. They were scoring 30 points on average a game, not
17.
Yeah, or 25 or whatever. What it's been for the last couple of years. The year before that was actually a pretty bad year in terms of points conceded on compared to all the other years as well. So his 2 years in charge have been 2 of the 3 lowest points per game scored in the Super League history, and the 2 worst points per games conceded since 2004. So it's hardly surprising that it's come to this.
No, not at all. And anecdotally, I think he's been on the cards. I mean, without even fleshing it out with evidence like that and statistics like that, I think just the products on the field and the results that have been borne out just tell you that as good a player as he was, and he was phenomenal. He's Mr. St Helens. You can't take away anything that he achieved at that rugby league club. It just hasn't translated into coaching, and it often doesn't.
Well, it's what we said last week or the week before. He's going to get rolled out next week on the Easter Monday game. It's like our greatest player.
Yeah.
And forget that he was our naffest coach who just dished up the dullest rugby we've seen for
That's it.
For
but
decades.
the bad doesn't cover
Not
the good,
at all.
or vice
Not
versa
at
for me. Do you know what I mean? What he achieved as a player for that club and what he means to St Helens fans will never be lost.
The statue jokes are that funny jokes. what makes me laugh even more is the pictures of the statue now, or will always have the totally wicked stadium part behind it, which is more of a joke than